Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Swati Biswas from the University of Calcutta, Department of Islamic History and Culture. Today we are discussing from the paper Economic History of India, the module Vijayanagara Economy. In this module, we are going to discuss the Vijayanagara economy and try to grasp the objectives of how agriculture and domestic trade in the heydays of Vijayanagara Empire flourished due to the policy changes of the efficient rulers of the time. Seaborne trade and the ports were also given importance during this time by the rulers to contribute not only to the economic situation of the empire but also the international overseas trade of the time. This was also the time when the temples were also seeing its heydays in South India. They contributed much to the socio-religious life of South India, but also was playing a very important economic life. We are going to therefore now discuss all this in this module. For introducing the module, we have to understand that the golden days of the Vijayanagara Empire in the 15th and the early 16th century was marked by their control directly or indirectly over the economic activities of the region. Flourishing trade and expanding agriculture were the marked features of this time. We have to understand that the rulers took the much needed interest in the economic activities. Without their interest, it would have been difficult for the empire to expand or keep their political position on hold. A number of markets rose along with the urban centers for which the empire was popular. It also took initiative to build roads which could connect these urban centers and facilitate trade. General wealth of the people therefore increased, and that boosted the standard of life or living in the general for the social changes to be marked. We have to discuss or start the economic changes with the maritime trade. We have to understand that Vijayanagara Empire occupied a very important position in the peninsula of India. That position could only be achieved by control of the maritime trade of the time, which the Vijayanagara rulers very efficiently did. The heydays of the Vijayanagara state were known for its maritime activity. The kings posed and called themselves therefore as the lords of the eastern or the western oceans. The term itself showed the pride that they took in these trading activities and also the realization they had that how important the trading activities would be. The existence of this empire did depend on the prowess of its control over the trade and commerce of the region. This was again a reason to bone of contention with the neighboring states. The existence of the Vijayanagara Empire always was at stake because of their economic position. The rulers had to be always alert as to how they could guard their economic control over the area. So that made them extra cautious and militarily more active. They were virtually in control of the Bay of Bengal, of course, in the east and the Arabian Sea in the west of the Indian peninsula during their heydays. The objective of the state was the domination of the coastal territories, which again was the only stake they could have for their economic existence and control over their affairs during that time. The geopolitical existence during the time of Krishnadeva Raya was well admitted in the contemporary documents. He always insisted that the responsibility of the king is to improve the harbors so that the commerce improves and the import of horses, elephants, precious stones and gems, sandalwood, pearls and other articles be freely imported. So therefore the documents were aware of the royal policies that Krishnadeva Raya took and how ports would become the key to their excellence. He also insisted that the distant merchants should be provided with the decent dwellings in the city and the villages and allow them to enjoy considerable profits. This is the policy to stop the articles going to the enemies. All of this was mentioned in the contemporary documents. The attitude of the ruler was therefore most congenial for trade to flourish. Access to the ports in South India would be congenial to the access of war horses, which was the main demand of the political class all over India. So even the North Indian rulers had to keep a kind of amicable relationship with the rulers of the South, because the supply of the war horses from the West would actually enter the subcontinent through the ports of Vijayanagar. The rituals and culture of the elite indulged in luxury meant the consumption of goods like sandalwood, musk and camphor. Gift exchanges of the royalty also included these goods. We have to understand that the medieval cultural ethics and the cultural pattern gave a lot of space to the elite class to have a lifestyle which would otherwise become very difficult for common man. Even the European elites did not have the standard of life that the 16th or 17th century elites of the subcontinent had. So therefore, consumption of certain goods was the marker of good life in India. The culture of gift exchange was also very popular among the elite cults of medieval South and also in the North. The claim of direct control was seldom exercised by the rulers of Vijayanagar Empire over the ports. They hardly exercised direct control over the western seaboards, a narrow strip of land that was separating the peninsular interior by the Western Ghats. So therefore, the claim that they actually could control the ports is not true. What actually they had was a kind of an amicable relationship with the local powers of these ports, and they were also in a position to keep them in good mood. Now let us discuss the ports which were making news at this time. Interestingly, Bhatkal port was controlled by a group of Jain chiefs who lived in the Kanara coast, that is in the present Karnataka state. The area was situated in the southwest of the Vijayanagara capital. Shipment of horses from the Arabian Peninsula reached the Bhatkal port. Horses from Iran also came directly to this port. The horses were then sent to the Vijayanagar capital through road. So actually, the Vijayanagara ruler was not controlling the Bhatkal port, but had a relationship with the Jain chiefs who imported these horses, and that would facilitate that the horses be sent to the market of the Vijayanagar capital and then from there to be distributed. And again, this important road was controlled and maintained by the Vijayanagara ruler. Copper and gold from the Middle East also came to the Bhatkal port. So somehow the North Indian rulers also had a certain amount of importance, or rather dependence, on the trade that was going on in the Vijayanagara capital. It was also engaged in the export of three important items: pepper, sugar and textile. Interestingly, as these goods moved into or out of Vijayanagar territory, they were subjected to various taxes levied by the Vijayanagar ruler, which was actually the mainstay of the rulers. The revenue from the commercial transactions that took place at the international ports like Bhatkal went actually to the local chiefs and not to the Vijayanagar state. Therefore, so it was a relationship, an amicable relationship that the Vijayanagar rulers had to maintain. The overlords of these western ports always encouraged the foreign merchants to come to their ports. The only sustainable income of the overlords were actually drawn from the import-export of goods from their ports. Arab merchants from the Middle East thus flocked to the southwestern coast much before the medieval period. The indigenous Muslim merchants of the area then swelled up due to intermarriages or at times conversions. Thus, a healthy set of business was conducted by this group. Now, let us discuss the port of Calicut and the role of Zamorins here. As a result of the above, all the phenomenon that has been discussed, the largest concentration of the Muslim merchants were found in the areas of Calicut in the North Kerala or the Malabar coast. The region of Calicut became the most popular and lucrative enterprise or free port of the western seaboard during the 14th-15th century. This ambience was created not in one day. The atmosphere of the congenial business class was the conscious policy of the local rulers, the Zamorins of Calicut. The Zamorins were wise enough not to plunder ships like their western littoral, seeking refuge from the storms. They never claimed the treasures of the wrecked ship on principle. They provided the much needed security to the merchants and their ships. The Arab merchants obviously were attracted to Calicut. This resulted to understand of Chinese travelers like Parkman to believe that the whole population of Calicut was Muslim. So kind of a cultural change was also taking place in the Calicut port. Now let us also talk about the Mapillars of North Kerala. They are a group of indigenous Muslim merchants who flourished during this time. Unlike local communities, they actively participated in the trade. The advantage of this community was that they spoke the local language Malayalam and observed many local customs. So they had an advantage, had a kind of a relationship with the suppliers from the interiors to the port. The Arab merchants dominated the overseas trade activity between Malabar coast and the west. The Mapillars were engaged in the trade activity along India's coast and also the sea routes to Southeast Asia. So therefore, they did not have any access to the west. According to a Portuguese contemporary record, the Mapillars comprised 1/5 of the population within the control of the Zamorins in the early 16th century. We also have to understand that it becomes very interesting to compile the informations, economic, social and political of this period because of the information supplied by the Europeans at that point of time. Now let us move to the Malabar coast, the other stories of the Malabar coast. The history of the trade activity of the Malabar coast is very long. The area has been engaged in international trade from the time of the Roman Empire. At least we find their names in the suggestive Roman records. Its chief export to the Western world was black pepper. The other items that were produced in Malabar were ginger, cardamom and teak, which became very popular in the Middle Ages for hardwood for shipbuilding, and the pricey aromatic sandalwood, which was one of the treasures that were exported. The local communities were traditionally engaged in the agrarian affairs and most played the role of suppliers of goods. The trading activity, therefore, has always been controlled by the immigrant merchant community. The area always boasted about the amicable relationship of both the groups, and it existed because of the economic interdependence. Now let us discuss the merchant communities that operated in this economic situation. Two of the ancient communities which lived in the area for long, apart from the Muslims, were the Syrian Christians and the Jews. The copper plate grounds of 9th and 10th century formed the area confirmed their existence. They were able to maintain their individuality and again became part of the cultural heritage of the area with much ease, even as on today. The Arabs also came to the region before the advent of Islam. The record of Muslim Arab merchants, though, date back only to the 9th century by the 15th century business communities from other parts of India flocked to this region. So this region had a kind of a cosmopolitan atmosphere which was very congenial for any economic activity. The Hindu Chettis of the southeast coast and the Baniyas from the Gujarat coast is also mention worthy. We have to understand that each of the community dependent on the other. There was a kind of interdependence, but also a kind of individuality, and this individuality was maintained by the goods that they exported or imported or were involved in the business. Chinese had a very important role to play in the Calicut port. Calicut became very popular for the Chinese traders. Records of the 15th century show that there were Chinese ships operating in this area in large number. The account of Ibn Battuta records for 13 such ships in 1340s on his arrival to the town. About a century later, Ma Huan confirmed the Chinese traded for the famous frankincense and myrrh from the Middle East. Pepper, diamonds, pearls and cotton textiles from India were the items that were brought them to this famous port. The Chinese in exchange would sell silks and ceramics. These items were in high demand in the West and also among the elites in India. Now let us talk about a very interesting fast Chinese diplomatic relation with the Vijayanagara Empire. Chinese had even built a diplomatic relationship with the Zamorines at this time. This led to the first naval expedition to Calicut. We have to understand that though it was a kind of a expedition to the Zamorin land, but of course the Vijayanagara rulers were also in some ways involved in this mission. The expedition was led by the famous Admiral Cheng Ho. He came later also with Ma Huan as the translator. This expedition consisted 317 ships with 27,000 men. Calicut always remained Cheng Ho's major stop as they journeyed further, went to Hormuz and Aden and then to Mogadishu in East Africa. Cheng Ho's expedition was exceptional as it traversed the whole Indian Ocean at one go. The other ship only did one flank, that is from South China to Java or Malacca, and from Malacca to Sri Lanka or India, and then from there to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, and then from there to the west. So this was the first of its kind, we can say. The appeal of the Malabar coast to the merchant was because the area had goods from Middle East, China, Southeast Asia on one hand, and the goods from the Indian subcontinent. These goods were brought to this place by the transshipment because of the geographical advantage of being in the middle of the route. Now let us talk about the first group of Europeans who appeared in this scenario, the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama, perhaps on behalf of the Portuguese crown, found the direct route from Europe to Calicut, and this changed the history of the subcontinent and the Asian overseas trade. The journey of search of paper and other fine spices later became the cause for European control of Asia. Portuguese were always hostile to the Muslim merchants who had relation with Calicut. Their ships became the large target of the Portuguese. This conflict was the new phenomena of the Indian Ocean, and the use of violence was the added feature of this conflict. This kind of violence for commercial objective was unknown to the merchants of Asia. They might have their own rivalry, but the use of arms and violence was a new addition. The artillery mounted on the heavy ships of the Portuguese gave them the advantage over indigenous ships. The indigenous ships were smaller in their content, and they were much lighter and did not have the facility for artilleries to be kept. This consequently led to the control of the important ports of Asia by the Portuguese. Thus, the Sri Lankan port of Colombo was taken over in 1505. The Malaya port of Malacca was taken over in 1511, and the Persian Gulf port of Hormuz was taken over in 1515. The strategic control of these ports now tilted the trade of Asian spices toward the Portuguese, and the merchants of Asia now were on the back foot. The political establishment, which had a relation with the emergence of the land, also suffered economic loss, and Vijayanagara Empire was no exception. The situation thus came when the Asian ship had to pay custom duty to the Portuguese, and they faced bombardment in the Indian subcontinent itself. The main center of their activity became Goa, and this could never be fully controlled either by the Vijayanagara Empire or any other indigenous power whatsoever, including the Mughals. The port was seized in 1510 from the local rulers. This port was much north of the main Malabar coast and thus remained outside the control of the southern rulers and also outside the control of the northern rulers. Goa posed a threat to Calicut, and the stiff competition and the importance of Calicut eventually declined to a considerable amount. As a result of this decline, the economic prosperity of the Zamorin's and the Vijayanagara Empire was also badly affected. Portuguese culture was quickly absorbed by the locals of Goa, and intermarriages led to the larger cosmopolitan of the west coast to another extent. Now let us move to the other coast that was controlled by the Vijayanagara Empire, the Coromandel coast. The Coromandel coast of the southeastern coast of India was dominated by the port of Pulicat during this time. It remained in the helm of affairs till the early part of 16th century. Situated on the border of modern Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, the port was linked to the capital of Vijayanagara Empire through roads. Pulicat was a famous port for textile of export to Southeast Asia and remained so for a very long time. A group of Muslim merchants and a diaspora of the Armenians monopolized this trade. The indigenous merchants also had a big group of Hindus. Spices like nutmeg, cloves and mace from Indonesia were imported. Non-precious metals were also imported during this time in the ports of Pulicat. Pulicat, interestingly, had an ongoing coastal trade with Bengal. Now, this kind of localized trades were also a feature that benefited the local powers operating in that system, and obviously the Bengal rulers along with the Vijayanagara Empire rulers would benefit from such localized trade. Bengal supplied foodstuff to the coast of Coromandel and Sri Lanka. It also supplied some of the good textiles that were produced in Bengal. The tax on these items were obviously imposed by the Vijayanagara rulers, and they shared the profit to a great extent. Mahuan named some 6 types of cloths that came from Bengal, which included certain silk and cotton. Bengal, interestingly, had a relationship with Southeast Asia, which operated through the Coromandel coast. Indians had a great role in the shipping within the water of India and Sri Lanka, to a lesser extent to Southeast Asia. The international trade was mostly controlled by the merchants of the other part of the world. Now let us now move to the economic situation in the domestic affairs of the Vijayanagara Empire. The ports of Calicut, Pulicat, Cambay in Gujarat or Chittagong in Bangladesh sold all kind of local products. Most of the items of these ports were brought overland by bullocks through the coastal trade. Since 13th century, the bulk of domestic trade in South India, that is peninsular India, increased not because of any international maritime trade. The port cities were boosted because of the excellent production of the subcontinent and supply of these products through internal trade. This in turn increased the international demand of these products. The domestic sector was much larger in value compared to the international sector, at least during the period that we are reviewing. The Vijayanagara rulers took great interest in the agriculture and irrigation of the time. They controlled the Tungabhadra valley and to some extent the Raichur Dwab. Even before the advent of the Vijayanagara rulers, the peninsula was flourished because of the agrarian production of these two regions. The irrigation facilities increased over time. The reservoirs were able to stop the rainwater and the smaller streams supplied seasonal flow to water for agriculture. South India was always very popular even in the ancient days for this reservoir building, and any big ruler, it was thought that to be a task to build reservoirs. The semi-arid uplands were now supplied with irrigated water, and this facilitated the agrarian production in both the Dwabs that have been mentioned. The marginal areas were also brought under cultivation because of the royal policies. This was also a time when commercial crops became very popular in the subcontinent. In the north, the Mughals took a lot of interest in the commercial crops, and in south we see the Vijayanagara rulers taking an interest in the growth of commercial crops, and it somehow added to the income of the state. Certain areas in the subcontinent and especially in the peninsula became popular for the production of cotton, sugarcane and indigo. The commercial crops travelled long roads for sale in the market towns and periodic fairs and distribution points along the coast. The long routes were maintained by excellent road services that the Vijayanagara Empire provided. These roads linked the urban centers and also facilitated the journey of the travelers. Now let us discuss about the urban space of the Vijayanagara Empire. Within the territory of the Vijayanagara Empire, there were 80 urban centers. The Vijayanagara capital had an estimation of about 3 lakhs to 4 lakhs population. The fortification along with the water facilities covered almost 650 square kilometers. After the city was abandoned, the ports of Pulicat and Bhatkal declined rapidly along with these urban centers. The activities of the Portuguese who had arrived in India in 1498 also contributed to this decline. The main cause of the decline of Bhatkal and Pulicat port was the loss of demand of the Vijayanagara capital and the market of the Vijayanagara state. Pulicat was supplanted by Masulipatnam, the chief entry point in the growing region of the Golconda kingdom. This definitely proved the importance of political power in the growth of any trading center. Now let us talk about the temple culture and how commerce was related to it. Large temple complexes were also the major consumers of food and luxury goods. These areas also stimulated trade to a great extent. The pious pilgrims donated not only land to these temples but also gems, coins, precious metals, and livestock. The items were used for daily use for the worship of the deities. Apart from this, regular festivals consumed these goods. The economic prosperity of the Vijayanagara Empire led to the increase in the number of festivals in these temples. The temples employed many people apart from the priests and administrators. These temples had entertainers like musicians and dancers and singers, giving avenue for new work to people. Sculptors, artisans of different kinds, and metal workers found employment in these temple areas, which were also main commercial centers. There are hundreds of inscriptions in the Sri Venkateshwara temple in Tirupati, recording the great expansion of the ritual activities that occurred during the Vijayanagara Empire. During this period, the temple received grants of over 100 villages as well as large sums of cash from the 300 donors. Most of the endowments of the Tirupati temple, whether in the form of land or money, were given to the support the ritual services of daily worship and festivals. The Vaishnava temples distributed food to the pilgrims, unlike the Shaiva temples, where food distribution is arrested only to the priests in the contemporary world. The volume of the food distributed during this period reached a surprisingly high level. One of the records informed that in 1504, the Venkateshwara temple could feed about 1,400 pilgrims on an ordinary day and about 3,800 on a festive day. The Vaishnava culture did spread to north from the Tamil land, and the spread was definitely enhanced by the trading activities of this period. The culture definitely favored the Vijayanagara kings economically. The officials on behalf of the state took interest in temple activities from the very start. Records of the donations show that the artisans and merchants benefited from the growing prosperity of the Vijayanagara state. As for example, there are records which showed that professional organization of traders would agree to make voluntary contributions to the specific temple, usually assessed as a percentage of goods sold. Records also show individual merchants or artisans donating a percentage of their income to the temple. Now, all these records therefore also speak loads about the standard of life that increase not of the individuals but the community of merchants, the community of artisans, and also the general people at large. Merchants were patrons for a long time in South Indian temples. During the Vijayanagara period, interestingly, the skilled artisans were in a position to become patrons, indicating their rise in income and also the prosperity of that time, as a large number of people were in a position to consume goods made by the skilled artist. The economic standing of the artisans, including weavers, rose. This also favored social changes, and these communities now demanded their social involvement in the temple activities. This, on the contrary, forced the demand of the use of the Tengalai branch of the Sri Vaishnava sect, which used the vernacular as its mode. Tamil language in its literature and not Sanskrit, and thus would be more accessible to the non-Brahmins and non-elite elements of the society. So this was a time which incorporated the larger group of people into the manifold of economic activities. This resulted in the uprise of the Tamil community of weavers like the Kaikola and many such groups. This led to the taking up of a responsibility of the temples of Srirangam and Tirupati. In the Tirupati temple, they were in charge of distributing sacred food offerings to the worshippers. Now we have to understand that the activities of the temples show at large as to how the economic prosperity brought about a social change that not only benefited the socio-cultural life of people there, but also contributed to the Vijayanagara economy at large. Now let us summarize as to what we have discussed in this module. We have to understand that the growth of urbanization and trade during the Vijayanagara Empire was more so like the pattern we see also in North India under the Delhi Sultanate. The 15th century and 16th century southern peninsula became the most dynamic area of the subcontinent, becoming the key players in the overseas trade. The age encouraged physical mobility, social diversity, and cross-cultural intercourse. The reality was that since the Vijayanagara rulers were Hindus, the religious groups or institutions were in favor of the Hindus. This also determined the degree of artistic statues and literary traditions. The court culture definitely influenced the general culture. Apart from this, the similarity of the Vijayanagara state regarding revenue system, military technology, palace architecture were much same in the other part of the peninsula. We have therefore discussed the economy of the Vijayanagara Empire at stretch. For more information, please log on to the EPG Pathshala website and the text added to this. Thank you.